Bill's just coming back from his daily walk, where he tries to do around about 8 kilometres a day. Oh, good morning, Bill.
Good morning.
You had a good walk this morning?
Yes.
Nice day for it.
Yes, very good.
Well, we'll pop inside and I'll ask you a few questions, shall I?
Good.
Right.
No problem.
Well, it's the 26th of March 2006. My name's Max Avery, and I'm sitting here with Mr. Bill Lawrence, and he's going to tell us about his life as a miner, a farmer, and an aviator. Right, Bill. Now, you were born in Waihi, and you went to the Waihi South School, I believe. Can you tell me what your first memory is?
You mean at school?
Not your first ever memory.
Well, my first ever memory was holding a cow, a rope on a cow. We had a house cow, and my father was away from Waihi, working away, and I had just leading the cow around, or she dragged me around from different clumps of grass, and she licked me across the forehead. And that was possibly, I'd be maybe 3.5, 4 year old, I should say, at the time.
Which would make it round about 1916 or so.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then, following that, about that time, a cousin of mine was brought back from the war, invalided back to New Zealand. He'd been gassed, and he came and stayed with us, and I remember him talking about the war and about the conditions over, to tell my mother about the conditions of the thing. He said that when he went away, the bands were playing, and that when they came back, nobody wanted to know him because he was invalid. That my father couldn't get a job back in the mine at the time because he had been one of the dumb militants of fighting for better conditions in the Martha mine, in which had the big strike. Incidentally, had that strike not have occurred, it would have exposed quite a swindle, possibly the second biggest swindle in New Zealand. There's the shares of the Martha mine. They had driven through. My father was in this team that were driving through, and that what had started off was called the 10 Guinea crosscut, where according to reports, that they ore at around 3 ounces to the tonne at that time, fantastic in value. This had broken up into blows of calcite, and that the reports had been falsified. And so to cover up this, they killed two birds with one stone by putting impossible conditions in front of the men, and the men went out on strike. And the answer was they flooded the mine, and then they said they'd lost the reef system through the floods. That was part giving my early history or early life.
What memories do you have of the school, the first school that you went to?
Well, in those days, it was, you learnt by rote, and you were severely punished if you stepped out of line or anything. The caning was just, you were ruled by, well, fear. That's what.
And did you learn much?
Well, yes, we got a good grounding in the ordinary tables and actually English language. Our teacher was a fanatic on the correct English grammar, and which has stood me in stead. Has helped me, I suppose, in my able to write and different things.
And you left school at the age of 14 with the proficiency certificate.
Yes, I was taken from the South School in Waihi and sent to the convent school. It must have been 1921, I think. and but it wasn't a success because I hated every Monday morning because we had to tell them why I didn't go to church on the Sunday. And as my father was away and his health, the mother and that, I had been the eldest boy in the family. I had to work. We had a few cows and a bit of farm, and I'd milk the cows and do things like that. And consequently, I wasn't didn't get on very well there.
Were you punished for not going to church?
Well, verbal punishment, yes. And then on one occasion, we had a bit of poetry, and it was about telling us that the world was round. But of course, in religious instruction, we were told if we were good, we'd go up to heaven. And then, so this bit of poetry was something you do this, and it said that as you're getting up, the people on the other side of the world are still going to bed, the world's round. So I put my hand up and I had to step out on the aisle and ask the nun, I said, well, if the world was round and people on the other side of the world would all be going away from one another, how are we going to meet up in heaven? The nun came towards me, and as I sat down, I collected 2 belts across the knuckles that drew blood for asking this question, to which she had no answer. And that was, well, I didn't get on very well missing things, so I was sent back to the South School somewhere about end of September in 1921. I failed that year in that class and was held back, which turned out to be the best thing, because from there on I got a better grounding of things, and the result was in the preliminary examination at the for crediting in the South School, I got a possible 386 marks out of the possible 400. They said, when it was read out, my proficiency was granted, and they said I'd gained the highest marks that had ever been gained at the South School up to that time. And then my father, he had tried to get back in the mine work, but he hemorrhaged, he was dusted, and he was on a pension, so I wasn't allowed to go back to school, to high school, but I did attend the School of Mines in Waihi. The trouble was, being young and didn't get up early, sometimes I'd go half asleep in the classes, but I managed to do all right in the examination for theoretical electricity and in mathematics, a few other smaller subjects.
You just made the comment there that your father had been dusted.
Yeah.
Now, what did you mean by that, Bill?
Oh, that is the silicosis dust. Actually, a lot of earlier miners, because there was dry boring in the mines until New Year's Day 1925. From that point onwards, dry boring was outlawed in the mines in New Zealand. The silica dust, it fits over the thing. Anybody had seen, like down Wairaki, and you see vegetation around that's got silica on it. Well, that's how the dust, or the silica, the finest, so fine that it breaks down. And the lungs, well, they block the cells, the lungs, from acquiring oxygen.
And your father, of course, had been a miner.
Yes.
In the Martha mine.
In his early days, he was born in Thames, and at the age of 14, his father had died, and he was working he was shoveling the roasted quartz into the crusher with no water, because there was clouds of dust, early times. And at that period, about 1922, 23, there were so many men that were starting to affected by the dust, silicosis, that they brought in legislation for the mining to be wet boring and water out of the crushing plants. In other words, makes life more tenable. Right.
So when you left school, you went to work on your parents' property for a start, and this was a mining district leased occupancy land.
Yes.
Now, what did that mean?
Well, when the Ohinamuri area was opened up by a fellow named Mackey, James, I think it was James Mackey, he was there, order was given that that land would, in the event of mining ceasing, would retreat back to it. It wasn't freehold. That the land under the mining district land occupancy lease, MDLO lease, that was that you retained the rights for that. And housing sections in Waihi, they were given, and you only owned the leasehold rights of it. And then when the mine closed, they had this 5 shillings a year. Well, it was costing them more, as much in the head office than what it was worth. So they came up with the idea that if 20 years for £5 you could get a freehold title for this land. But before that, there was Bradford Street, as anyone knows Waihi. Now it ends at, well, they go to property that I used to own, but there's from there to the river's about 15 chains. And that land, that piece of land, my parents applied, seeing they owned land on both sides of it, of this road, they applied for its closure, and that was done, and a freehold title was given to this. The net result was somebody pointed this out, that was illegal, so they had to pass a special act of parliament to legalise this. And that was the thin end of the wedge. From there on, the politicians, they say, oh, well, it was done there, it could be done somewhere else. And as I say, land was able to be freeholded later on in that district.
So your parents really had a small farm then?
Yes.
And you worked on the farm?
Worked on the farm,
Was
yes.
it mainly a dairy farm, was it?
A dairy farm, and we got Jersey cows in, and our herd name was, or the farm name was called River Terrace. You had to have a name for the herd, a River Terrace, and we were Jersey breeders, and that kept that name.
And you always had a pedigree herd?
Well, yes. Well, we had, when I came back to Waihi in 1952, I wrote to them, the dairy, and they said that name still prevailed, was still on the books. So I started, and I had a mixed herd that was aiming to get a pedigree Jersey herd, that carry on from that.
And what was your first job then, after a period working on the farm?
Well, our first job was I had a paper round for a while, but then I got a job at the mine, working in the blacksmith shop. I was supposed to have got an apprenticeship job, but that fell to some other person, had more influence or something. And I worked in the blacksmith shop heating the steel, and I learned about what they call the steel sharpening, that line of blacksmithing.
Who was the blacksmith at the time, do you remember?
Yes, well, there were 3 actually. We worked, there was 2 on day shift and 1 on afternoon shift. So the early one was Paddy Garvey, man, and Jumbo Lloyd, and Bill Angel was the other chap. And crossmating me was Ron Butler.
And you learned quite a bit of basic metallurgy there, did you?
Oh, well, I got a bit about this, and going to the School of Mines, I learned a bit about things. And then I applied for and got a job with the power board in Matamata. I started there it was I think early in January. But what had happened, the big crash on Wall Street on October the 28th, 1929 had reverberations in New Zealand, and all hell broke loose around about in May. They just dumped 25 in one smack, and it was the last on, first off kind of proposal, and one of them was made unemployed. And that was heralded the big depression, the biggest economic crisis in the world up to that time.
And what did you do?
Well, I came back to Waihi farm and worked there, but the price of dairy products had fallen from normally around about 18 pence, 1 and 6pence in the old line, it was around about that price, down to 8 pence. And they paid out, started off only 5 pence halfpenny advance payment. And because the market had just collapsed, well, a whole lot of farms just walked off their land, and there was big crisis. But the Martha mine, then, the price of gold had risen from £4.2 to about £8.8. But at the same time, when the big cut, they cut the price, cut our wages 10%, and the company had made the record profits of over £250,000 at that time.
In the meantime, I think you'd gone to Napier, had you?
Oh, that was after I went down. After I went down, I was in the Napier district when the big earthquake hit.
What were you doing in Napier?
Well, I'd been working on a farm out from there, and I'd gone in. Matter of fact, I was on the road at the time between Hastings and Napier, or a bit out from that, and that's when the earthquake hit.
You were actually on the road at the time?
Yes.
What sensation did you feel?
Well, the first instinct was I realised that, and there was a post and rail fence, and I grabbed hold of that and looked around in time to see a chimney fall off. Just in that split second, I saw the shock wave, the P wave as it's named called, pressure wave, hit, and it moved, and there was a top part of a brick chimney sitting out nothing for that fraction of a second. I just happened to see that. And it's geologists I've spoken to after reckon that it's marvellous to see that be in that position to actually see the pressure wave hit. And it's like it would hit with a great force because the speed of it through the earth, it was, I've forgotten what the figures are now, but it's right high, so it meant that it was hit, and the jolt that left this chimney standing up on nothing for a fraction of a second till it crashed down. But I was around there for another few weeks, and I came back to Waihi, and that'll be about the end of February. But I got...
That was in 1931, of
yes.
course, yes.
Then I went to work as a fellow, Fred Robertson. He was trucking, and he had attended school of mine, so I went working with temporary work with him for a while, and then gradually...
Now, when you said he was trucking, what did you mean by that?
Well, in the Martha mine, they had the big stopes and what they call shrinkage stopes. That meant that they were never filled behind. And when they'd worked out the ore, they took out all the ore and left this big vacant space. And the truckers had to go in, and if there was value, they took out the timber, the old timber that was left, and got all the remains of the last bit of the quartz.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to truck that out from wherever it was out to the shaft, at either number 4 or number 6 or whatever shaft we was working. That was the beginning. You started off with that generally in the mine.
And when you say trucking, you meant you were putting it into small railway wagons, were they?
Yeah, well, small. The mine, they got some outside the Martha mine there. Outside the museum, I modelled it, and they got one in the museum. And There's a mock-up of that. It's well worth anyone going in the museum to have a look at their methods of mining, but it's better if you can get someone that's worked there and to give a bit of explanation.
These little trucks were pushed by hand, were
Oh,
they?
all hand, yes.
Was it level pushing or uphill?
Well, some areas they were driven. They followed the reef system, and they were some of them were quite steep. And you'd really push the full truck either or level or downhill. Sometimes it was so far downhill you had to use a stick, put a timber in. There was a kind of a brake stick to hold them.
And how did you get them back out again?
Oh, the trucks were pushed through. Everything was done by hand. The master company relied on muscle power. They were not advanced. I went over to work in Australia. I went over to Mount Isa and I worked there, but there was totally different outlook. Mount Isa was all heavy work was done mechanism, whereas the Martha miner was everything was muscle power.
Now, Frederick Robertson,
Yeah.
with whom you were working, he would have been a contractor, would he, to the Martha company?
No, he himself was a trucker, a going line like that. He later studied and went on to the School of Mines and got his first-class manager's ticket. Then he went into the coal during the war. So I did as many as possible could round up to go into coal mining. I worked in mines while I used to suffer severely with jelly headaches. It's the nitrous fumes, and so I left it. I'd gained a quarry manager's and tunneler's ticket, so I went on worked in a quarry over at Morrinsville rather, out of Morrinsville, Motormaho quarry, and. I'd come back to Waihi periodically, and work in the mine, and then go away again.
Frederick Robinson, it's worth noting, I think, that just yesterday, which was March the 25th, 2006, there was a miners' reunion in Waihi, and you and Frederick met up again.
Yes, he is 3 months older than me, so he's 90. He'll be 94 in July. I'll be 94 in October.
Where's he living now?
At Tauranga.
In Tauranga, I see. Uh-huh.
Yeah, he is quite fit. Fred is mentally alert. We get on well together.
Now you left the job at the Martha mine in 1933 and sailed to Australia. And there you carried your swag, you told me, from Sydney to Mount Isa.
Yes.
Now, can you tell us a bit about that trip from Sydney to Mount Isa? What you did?
Well, we started off by hiking and then finished up, I got with some others, and we jumped the rattler, as they call it. But this part particularly, there's a place, Taree, up north of Sydney, I suppose a couple of miles north. We rode the rods from there to Johns River. And
now, what did this consist of exactly, Bill?
Hanging on underneath the part and under the carriages, and they put me up in front, and every time the joker shoveled in, the sparks had come back, and you couldn't let go because you'd be hanging, be a lot of mincemeat along the rail track. Well, they ran into Johns River. There'd been a flood, and they stopped. I crawled out from underneath, and there would no bloody power would get me to go back underneath. That was one thing that I've had one lot of experience with. I wouldn't care to repeat.
How did you complete the journey?
Oh, well, we did hiking, any open trucks, or anything at all, getting our way up. I spent time, but at that time in Australia they had the unemployed, the youth were travelling, and go 60 cents, 6 shillings a week. That's what you got. And you got that once a week. And if you stayed in a town for 6 weeks, you could be claimed as a member of that town, and you'd get 14 shillings, 1 day's work. You had to put in an appearance, do some work for it, but you got 14 shillings. So they decided it was far better to keep the pobos walking from town to district. You go up north, then they'd mark your card negotiable southward only. And you go down to the south, near the south part, they'd mark it north, negotiable northward only. It was quite interesting, the experiences.
But you got yourself a job at Mount Isa
yes.
without any trouble at all, did you?
I went there and I'd carried my union clearance, and I told them I'd been to the School of Mines in Waihi, and that the School of Mines in Waihi was well known, internationally known in mining, so I got a job there. And
what were you doing?
Well, first off it was trucking, and then
what sort of ore? What were they working there, Bill?
there was silver lead mining,
Yeah.
and the big danger there was lead poisoning. But then I got on. They were changing from the carbonate ores to the sulfides for a different treatment process. So they closed down the big open cut, and they put me on what they called nippering. It was taking the steel to the men and checking out, seeing them applied with material. I went to a place and there was 2 chaps having a lot of difficulty, but they just simply weren't capable of the mining. So I adjusted the machines for them, and of course they were beautiful machines and they were ringing, boring. Chap got my number, so next day I was sent down to be mates of this fellow who had been a professional wrestler at one part of it. And he didn't play the game according to the rules that they had laid down, and he dumped the so-called specialist, put him in the hospital, and so he got outed, wiped, and he came to work in the mines. Strong as a horse and had about as many brains as... Well, he lacked experience in mining, that's what it amounted to. But anyhow, I was there in the ISA and eventually came honorary secretary of the union at the age of 22, and I learned a lot of the chicanery and dealing that went on in higher places.
What caused you to come back to New Zealand from Mount Isa?
Well, the sister wrote to me and said that mother was very sick and she was up in years, so they wouldn't give me leave, so I came back home, and but instead of getting married, I met up with my what became a future wife. I went to Auckland for work on a drainage job, and at T-Papa, putting in drainage, and one of the parts of the job was along the footpath and where to shoot the rocks out, big rock, rock there, and I'd shoot it out, but of course it meant just firing light shots, breaking up the rock to get out.
Prior to this, of course, you'd been 2 years back in the Martha, hadn't you?
Yes, I'd been back
when you returned. Well, we'll just stop for a moment here, Bill, and take a look at a couple of photographs of the Martha as it was then.
Yeah.
This is the headgear at number 6 shaft at the Martha mine in Waihi, and Bill Lawrence worked in this area during his second stint in 1935. Two miners hand trucking ore underground in the Martha mine, and this is the sort of work that Bill Lawrence was engaged upon. Well, Bill, you came back in 1935 and you went back to the Martha to work there.
Yes.
And who were you working with and what were you doing?
Oh well, I got working in the Junction area, a Junction mine that had been taken over by the Martha Company earlier on, and I think it was Peter McNamara's job. I was in there, but we worked in that. But was one thing about when I came back, it was a late spring and we were getting these hail showers and my bones ached with the cold. But anyhow, I worked in this around in that area for a while.
And you were actually drilling ore, were you?
Yes,
and taking it out?
Yes, working it up. And then, let's see what happened.
And you had an interesting experience in the darkness. Could you tell us what happened then?
I had one, that was experience when I came back. I was trucking out from number 11 level, and I was only one on the level at the time. So I went up and I'll come out, you turned, the stope was across, that I'd hit the rip bit, and so we were right angles turn, and had a flat sheet. A flat sheet is a big flat sheet of iron down, and you had to bring your truck out and you had to turn it around on that, swing it around. And anyhow, there was a bit of water, and this one spot of water ladder came down right on a candle. I must remember in that light, which had a candle was the main means of illumination.
One single candle.
One single candle.
Yes.
And you put that on the front of your truck and you'd go down, well, put that out. I reached, no matches. That's bad, but I knew I had some coat out of the shaft. So I walked out, head along, was running 1 foot along the rails. And you could tell by the sound that you couldn't get close to a wall or anything like that. But I kicked my foot along, suddenly I heard a clang, and this went into space, and I froze. But you wonder what the hell what's happened. So I eased my way back slightly, probably a couple of feet, then bent down and run my hand on the rail, and then there was an open space. This doesn't sound very healthy. Didn't know where I was because there should be no part of that. Anyhow, I got back, followed around and turned around, hang on to one rail and turned around till I was out, and followed my way out and came to a pair of points. So that was all right. When you got to the shaft, came back and had a look with this, and they'd put in the dump old any mullick stuff down. They were going to put another drive in, so the unproductive ore, they dump it down, unproductive rock, they dump it down their workings. And a normal thing is, in that case, you either covered the hole over or put a board across, what we call a firing board. That means you don't go behind that. But that's just one of the things that the Martha Company, they cut a hell of a lot of corners and got away with things.
And if you hadn't sensed that empty space was there.
Well, I didn't sense empty space. Another step, if I hadn't kicked that loose stone and it rattled down into space, I wouldn't be here now.
I understand you had another brush with death when your guardian angel was sitting on your shoulder with a bit of explosive. What happened then?
Was in the younger days when I was working with a chap, and he didn't turn up. So they said, you can go and truck in the reserves. It was a frosty night. The reserves at number 2 shaft, they had surplus up there, and if you're getting down, production's getting down low, they put a chap on temporary, and you had to bring it down to number 4 shaft part for the loading. And they sent me in and they said, here's some jelly, can of jelly in it. So I was in this, and it hung a bit, and I looked at it, and I thought, I'll have to put a shot on that, say what we called a blister on it, and put a shot on it. So I thought I would only need half a plug. I broke that, and instantly a blue spark jumped about a quarter of an inch across this thing, and I was horrified. I was down there petrified with this, and I thought, oh, well, too late now, bugger it. I was gone. Later in the army, I was did a course on with the chap for the ICI on explosives, and that. Anyhow, I mentioned this, and this chap from the ICI, he said, "Did that actually happen to you?" I said, "Yes." Well, I must mention by now that couldn't happen because they have the antifreeze stuff put in the jelly, and those times that jelly was frozen, and it becomes very temperamental. And he said, well, the only thing I can say to you, your guardian angel was looking after you, because he just couldn't understand why it didn't explode. It would have killed me, you see. It would have blown both hands off and would have killed me. But
And I think you said only one other chap had ever...
oh yes, that was later in time, Jack Higgins, and his mate, he had a boat, and we were out and got talking about old mining days, and I mentioned about this. He reached over and shook hands. He says, "You're the only other one that had that experience." He was in his trucking days, when his early days in the mine. He had that at the junction shaft. It was a downcast shaft in a frosty weather, and the jelly, he had the same experience. But of course nowadays with the glycol in the mixture, it just that couldn't happen because you wouldn't freeze at that rate.
Better to be born lucky than rich, Admiral.
Yeah, well, the devil look after his own, I suppose.
So, what caused you to leave the Martha
Well, I
after a
finished
couple
up
of years?
mining. Well, I came to a point, it went back to the School of Mines, but there were others had their tickets, and I looked and could see mining was running out eventually, must run out. And I got offered a job because I had the quarry ticket. It was for tunnelling and for a surface quarry.
And this is when you went up to Auckland, was it?
Yes, on a drainage job and shot firing. And
Who were you working for there?
Moody, J. Moody was that, but he had a contract for putting the sewerage in for at Te Papa. Mm-hmm. And that's when I took interest in flying. I went and started. I went out there, and
what sparked that?
well, I don't know. Just I saw planes flying around, and we went out and had a look at the airfield and saw it. And thought I'd have a try it. It was flying.
And your first flight was with Squadron Leader Allen, I believe.
Jack,
Dave Allen.
Oh, D.M. Allen,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And he put me on there, and the first, of course, it was flying. You had to hold it. You fly straight ahead. But like most other, you're rigid and you don't let the machine fly itself. That is the first thing you've got to learn in flying to be successful. Relax. Let the machine do the flying most itself.
What was your first airplane was Gypsy Moth, I believe.
Yes, the old Gypsy Moth.
What was it like?
Well, they were open, and the pilot sat the instructor sat in front of you, and they were around. Sat in the Gypsy behind you. He sat in the front. And the Tiger Moth, which I went on to later, that was reversed. The instructor sat in the front part. You sat at the back. Your passenger always in the front. You flew from the back seat. Yeah.
What was your first? This was at Mangere, the old Mangere
yeah,
airstrip.
it was a grass strip then.
Yeah.
They were still building it up. The unemployed were working there, and they were levelling it off. And in those days, it was understood thing you based on the engines not being reliable, and if you made once you shut your motor off, to all intents and purposes, you didn't have a motor, so you had to glide in, and we were taught this and approach. That meant you didn't come in on a long glide, but you came up and watched it for the wind direction, and later we were taught to side slip, and to be able to get into a small paddock or apart from it's today those methods are gone, except it was good training for chaps like who took on aerial top dressing. In those times, of course, the Tiger and the others didn't have any flaps, and they were just was built everything based on your judgment.
I understand your first solo flight was a rather interesting one. Was that where you had rather a high crosswind?
That was first solo flight. Wind had swung around the northeast and was coming up with nasty. We waited a while and it didn't seem to be improving. The instructor said to me, "Do you feel like having a go?" And I said, "Oh." He gave me his chest circuit. And he said, "Oh, I thought you'd be right." He said, so when we came in from the northeast, at that time there was the old clubhouse. There was so you came in alongside the clubhouse, and just as I was only a few feet above the ground, there was a gust swept sideways, and instinctively I clamped on full rudder and checked that and made a landing. And as it happened, there was a group there, and Ted Burrows said he was then. Who was Ted? Yeah. Anyhow, he kept in from the air department. He said that was quite a good effort. And they looked at the plane, and I said, "Oh, that's Lawrence, his first solo." And he came out and he congratulated me on it. This idea of instinctive flying, landing it. But others could do those things.
So you got away to a good start then?
Yeah.
Now, of course, that was a bit of hallowed turf in aviation terms, because Jean Batten landed there, didn't she?
Yes.
After her solo flight from
Yeah.
Australia. Did you happen to see her at all?
No.
You didn't go out for that?
No, I shut it. And there was another chap before that, two of them, they flew over in a push moth. And I met them, it was one of those later. But, there was quite a few chaps who did early training there at Mangere.
Mm-hmm. Well, you flew quite a number of types, I see. Miles Whitney Straight, Ercoupe, Rearwind, Pipers, Foxmoth, Victor, Jodel, Oster. So we'll take a look at those, shall we, and see what they look like.
Mm.
This is a DH-60G gypsy moth, similar to that which Bill first learned to fly in. Pictured here are two gypsy moths of the Auckland Aero Club, joyriding off Takapuna Beach in 1934. It's very likely one of these aircraft that Bill actually flew and made his first solo in. In the background is the club's puss moth, taking passengers on a joyride. Another of the de Havilland types that Bill flew was the DH-83 Foxmoth. This is one of Bert Mercer's Foxmoths shown flying on the west coast of the South Island. Two more aircraft in Mr. Bill Lawrence's logbook. An Oster, that's the aircraft in the foreground here, and above and behind it another de Havilland model, the Tiger Moth. Bill Lawrence also achieved type ratings on these two aircraft, Rearwind Sportster and a rather sleek looking Miles Whitney Straight. The Jodel home built he flew was rather more basic.
but the Cessna 172 was a rather more comfortable cabin monoplane. And as this photograph shows, using a little flap, the 172 had quite a brisk takeoff performance. Bill Lawrence was one of the few New Zealand pilots to gain a type rating on this little Ercoupe, an American-designed aircraft with twin tails. It was flown to New Zealand in 1947 by Harry Newton, who had been with the Royal New Zealand Air Force in England. And later on, after it had been almost scrapped, it was rebuilt by an aircraft engineer called G.N. Wells. Mr. Wells is seen here on the right, about to take a BOAC captain, O.P. Jones, on a flight from Auckland Airport. And this was the aircraft that Bill flew probably before its restoration.
Well, Bill, it's now March 31 and we're resuming the interview after putting some aeroplanes onto the tape here. Now, just looking back at these interesting types you've flown, the rear one, what was she like?
No dihedral, and you swung like the bottom part swung like a pendulum, and you wonder what was wrong. The first I flew that for about without a equity in it, and I wonder, when I stepped out, I wonder what the hell was wrong with it. I found we really had to look at the plane. There's no dihedral, so you send the pendulum effect. I understand that was really originally designed for an ambulance plane in America. It was simple, easy to fly, a beautiful machine, but that was the problem. No dihedral, and she had a pendulum effect.
See, now the Miles Whitney Strait looked like a very sleek looking aircraft.
Yes.
How did she handle?
Very good, really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
I did that one down South Island on that, and I really liked it, Mike.
Uh-huh.
That's right. Yeah.
And how did the Tiger Moth, which you flew later, compare with the Gypsy that you first soloed in?
Well, the Tiger she was more, she was a light machine. The Gypsy was a light machine. The Tiger the Tiger had not much forward vision when you're taking off. It had something like a Cherokee in that, or Cherokees like that in respect that it had very little forward vision when you take off. Once you got your tail up and that, it wasn't so bad, but it's been sitting back with the pilot. The Tiger was such an amiable kind of thing that you could land it, no trouble. A light hand, very for a light plane. I doubt it's a much better ones ever built. But for built-in headwinds, for it had the ability for getting off quite quickly. But for other than that, it didn't have a great visibility with the front of it. But it's, so far as light and handle, easy. It's great machine. Well, they've stood the test of time.
And what about the Fox Moth now?
Yeah, well, that's like an overgrown tiger moth. Much the same characteristics.
I see.
And you could perch up on top.
And the little Jodel, the home built?
Yeah, well, that was, you had to watch that for landing. And she was so light, the speed. And if you've been used to flying a bit faster, the trouble was you felt you could get out and walk alongside of it.
And the other one, of course, the very interesting plane that you flew was the little Ercoupe.
Yeah.
How did that handle? I understand her controls were a little different.
Yes, they had no pedals for your rudders. They were interconnected, and but she had the ability sitting in there stable, but would be sinking, which could attract. She was written off, I think, 3 times that day from that mistake. So I struck my first flight with that. I had something the same feeling. After that, the first landing I made of that. After that, I came in with the motor on, a fair bit of motor on, to keep my speed up until I was right on the deck.
And that was the best technique.
Yeah, well, that's what to me I felt the safest, because I felt she'd sit there and sink down. Well, that's how it can spoil the paintwork.
It must have been quite a remarkable little aircraft to have flown all the way out from Europe to New Zealand,
yes.
though.
Yes, it's the only thing, if you've got a crosswind in landing that, or taking off, landing that, it would take off, you had, what I've found a little bit of experience, I build up your speed, but you will hold it down right on the deck down, and then just lift it off suddenly. So there's no strain on the undercart.
Ah, yes.
Otherwise, you take it.
And of all the aircraft that you flew, which did you enjoy most being up in?
I think the Cessna.
The 172?
Yeah. They could get off the ground quicker than the Cherokee. And of course, the Cherokee being a low wing job, if you're looking for any place or that for down, you have plenty of vision looking up, but trying to find a place, you're low wing, it's a bit difficult. But I like the Cessna 172. She was really. You felt as though they were light and the controls and all that, but I like them. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, well, you've flown more types than most, so you're a good one to say that about it. So, after you started learning to fly, you went to the Morrinsville Quarry for a little while.
Yeah.
And then World War II found you under Albert Park digging air raid shelters for the army. How did you get into the army?
I was coming in the army. No, that's I had been working in Auckland in a factory for a while, and I didn't like it, the fumes and dust and stuff. So I came back to Waihi for a while. I come down, got work because I could get work in the mine pretty neat from experience, any part of it. And then there was a chap from Bill Buchanan came down there looking for me. They were going to he told me the idea was going to put tunnels under Albert Park. So I thought, right, I went back because I had an underground ticket, and went up and had to talk to the engineer, Joe Clark, who was engineer for Auckland City Council. And that's right, so I got teamed together and I was in charge of number 5 block. That's straight up off the end of Victoria Street East. And that was designed, there was 2 other tunnels along there, 2 tunnels, so there were 3 altogether, but there was just 2 were close, and the idea was that we're going to arch this over, and they were going to take that after and put a traffic line right through there, and there was to be an underground station alongside of this for an underground rail system, electric rail system. Oh, a great idea, but like everything else, after the war they just shut it down, filled it in, and that's that.
How big were the tunnels, Bill?
We were, from memory, it's about, I'd say about 15 feet wide, and that got to about 12 feet high. So that's about, 4 meters plus. So that's.
And how long were they?
Oh well, they only went through under Albert Park. I should say, what's it? Several, about 200-300 metres across Albert Park. I'm not quite certain of the actual distance, but around about 200-300 metres.
And of course they were never used, I suppose. Were they actually used in practice though? Did people practice using them?
And the only time they tried out was people, they flew the planes low over to simulate a bearing, and everybody rushed out to the streets to see the planes. No, unfortunately, in New Zealand, of course, we hadn't realised the full potential of Air Force. That was early part of the war, you see, when the Japs had come into us. But the idea was good for people quickly getting in.
No. And they were quite deep underground, were they?
Oh, well, they'd been deep enough to save a bomb. They weren't deep because Albert Park's only, I don't know what, 150 feet above sea level or something like that. And they had plenty of cover. They were safe in that respect. Yes.
And all that tunnelling would have been by hand, I suppose, was it?
Yes. That was soft rock in there. And we didn't have any big loaders at all loading. We were all done by hand, yes. Equipment.
And you were then man-powered out of the army and into the coal industry.
Yeah, well, I was in the army and I did extension course on explosive use for different type of explosives, and that because I had the practical experience of the mining, and I had a corporal. I was in charge of an area around. I had a unit for a compressor and all that, machines and drills and all that. When the Americans came down and we lived up north, I was sent around the areas and sink soak holes for the latrines and stuff like all that, that class of work. And then blasting rock out for quarry for around the things. Then it was after the tide turned in 1943. I was man-powered from the army into the coal mines, and I was sent first to Ohura. I wasn't very happy about that because I just spent the time they were haggling between their heads of what to do to open up a new coal field. It's quite a big coal field in a good quality coal, but they were arguing the points about how it was going to be handled and all the rest of it. So I left there and I went over to Bennydale, and there at the time that sports township, Keith Quennell, his father was manager of the mine, and I worked there, was trucking for a while. Then I was put on special timbering work.
So Bennydale was an underground mine?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
It was quite. It's a lower grade coal, but it's 35 foot thick. But they had a problem that it would heat and spontaneous combustion. As on account, yes.
And the shafts had to be timbered for safety, did they?
Well, not the shaft. Well, strictly speaking, a shaft in our mining terms is where you go down vertically. This was an incline. It came right to the surface. And another chap and I were given a job. We opened up another area and it was going to take out a different system altogether. But the value of the coal, it had a high ash content and quite a bit of moisture in it. It was a low-grade coal, and it was 35 foot thick, the seam, huge seam, and it's a basin. It goes down quite deeply. The incline depth was about 1 3 grade, and so they had problems with that, and the country was faulted and broken. But I had experience there. There's one time, of course, it's under the mining regulation, if gas has been discovered in a mine in the preceding 24 hours, the phone must run for another 24 hours without interruption before any person got underground. Now, we struck at my brother Joe and I were picking up old workings, and we got in there and I struck gas. And of course, it's amusing, the inspector of mines who came around, so he signed his thing of the previous day. And the chaps that normally, when they're going around in the thing 2 hours before men come into the shift, they go through around and they check. That's under the older regulations. And they this day examined the mining places and it's free from gas. On that day, I looked up the thing and they had omitted this thing of free from gas, because if it had gone through, if a big gas had been mentioned under the regulation, well, the mine would have to close, because we had blackouts at that time, half an hour at the time, meal time break. So we'd all come out of the work at our place back to the intake where the fresh air was coming down. We'd have it and then we'd go back to it, you see. And they'd cut the power off to save us half hour of time. It was a pretty grim situation, a power situation in New Zealand then. That was in 1933, 34.
40.
Correction, 44.
Yeah.
And even straight after the war, that situation was really grim for power. They would do anything to get coal.
So you got the mine going again.
Yeah.
Gas
So
free.
I came back to Waihi.
And after during this time, Bill, you were there, you became president, I believe, of the Miners' Union.
Yes.
And you were there at the time of the 1951 wharf strike.
Yes.
And what action happened consequent to that?
Well, we stood out, but the Ohura, they had a part of our union. They stayed. Some of them, well, they had men from overseas, from Poland and other parts, had come to work in the mines there, and they were under this order, and they kept working. But that big struggle of 1951, it was an attack on the trade union movement throughout New Zealand. We've got to go into this. It was part of the Cold War policy that followed later, or Cold War followed at that time, and that was a problem. I became, at the time I was chairman of the union. I was risen out of a motion of no confidence in the previous leader, and anyhow I was nominated and stepped into the breach, and that I happened to be chairman of the school committee, and I was chairman of the co-op store. Besides that, I was secretary treasurer of the sickness and death benefit fund, and also secretary to a town committee.
You must have been just about Mr. Bennydale.
Yeah, well, actually, when the people in New Zealand voted for conscription, I wouldn't go back on the school committee and got roundly criticised. They reckon I was taking spite out of the kids. But I said, well, no, what proved to be the correct thing, what happened, was that the monies that we wanted for school and things like that, they were severely curtailed. And we had raised that. I'd done, along with a few volunteers, did quite a lot of work. But the point was, if there's anything went wrong at the school or on the school committee, my brother and I had done quite a bit of timbering work in Martha mine, and we would do timbering work on night shift. That's midnight, or what they call dog watch, midnight till 8 in the morning. And sure enough, they'd come along, all the birds are building a nest up in the roof up there. There's a tap dripping out here. Want to send a note along. Want to get Bill to come down and fix things up. Well, I didn't mind this, but when the people voted for conscription of the youth, and that, I said, no way. No.
Hmm. Why did you consider that your union should come out in support of the Watersiders?
Because it was an all-out attack. There's Watersiders. This was organised. Well, we now know that this was planned attack on the unions right through, and we were supposed to have a new order after the war. And when we asked for the first instalment of the new order, firstly they fought us, and so we threatened it. So we got the 7-hour day for mining, but there was an all-out attack on the world movement, World Trade Union movement, and that's the way we saw it. We wanted the first instalment of what we were promised, and this was going to be over the horizon. We've got to get back to the old order. We said, no, we were told we're going to have a new order. But at the time, those of us that had made a study of things, we saw quite obvious that what we were going to get was neither new nor order.
So how long were you out for?
Well, 151 days.
How did the miners survive in that time?
Well, some of them we got money from overseas and around, or other trade unions supported us, but I didn't accept 1 penny from that. I had money I'd saved in the banking from us, and we lived on that. We had our own garden, and I did a bit of boot repairing for kids that gone to school and things like that. I doing work, but that was the point. We were in a struggle that was, to me, was clear what was coming up. The whole world was promised. It was Vera Lynn in that song. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover when the world's free.
Mm-hmm.
But the big boys, as we know now, were planning this right from when the Russians trapped the German army. They realised that the blitzkrieg had failed, and that was it.
Tell me, did you ever meet Finton Patrick Walsh?
No, I never met him, but I had others just as bad as him. This Finton Patrick Walsh, his proper name was Toohey. He'd come from round Gisborne way. But he was another one of these people that he was preaching this, but he was actually a millionaire himself. He owned farms, he had interest, and he was far from being a worker's man.
So you didn't have a great deal of time for him then?
No, definitely not.
Uh-huh. Of all the trade union leaders we've had, Bill, in New Zealand, who have stood out, in your opinion?
Well, Jock Barnes, as a trade unionist, as a leader of the working class, that clearly saw things. The waterfronts, they saw this, and they saw the tie-up that was developing, and that's the reason why they were smashed. We can go right through, taking Waihi as an example. If the Waihi strike had not have occurred, it would have uncovered the second biggest swindle in New Zealand up to that time. The land question was certainly the most, but the Martha swindle, the Martha Reef, they called it the 10 guinea crosscut, where the guy was going and it's 10 guineas a tonne. The value of the 3 ounces of gold to the tonne was extremely rich. But that only went in for a short distance, and then it broke up into blows of calcite, lower grade stuff, but they falsified the reports on this. How I know about this, well, firstly, my father was one working in that team, and they just struck this. And the other part was that I attended the School of Mines, and they told us about how this was formed, the reef system, and then with the definite enrichments. And what they got at that level was what the bonanza were, the ascending waters. It met the descending waters, and at that level Well, that's what you call a bonanza. They mixed. See, Waihi mine was volcanic, the Martha system.
So the report falsification was for what purpose?
Well, there's two purposes. They had, firstly, at that time, the trade union movement was starting to develop and gain power, and the second one, of course, was to cover up the swindle. So they reckon that when the mine, there was a chap, an American, who came to New Zealand, how he came to be here, and he came to Waihi. Now, 25 years after that, they had a big meeting in Waihi, and I met this chap, J.B. King. He was a well-known American trade union leader. He came to Waihi and he said to them, "Get back to work. Your company is not going to budge. So if you haven't gained your objective within a fortnight, 3 weeks to the outside, then get back with your forces intact." But Sample and these others said, "No, we'll flood them, I will teach them so." And this, when you look back now over what these other so-called great union leaders had called out and would take on a head-on clash with the state, you've got to question their integrity. Because they should have known, and as J.B. King said, really we didn't have an organisation properly. These so-called leaders were not aware of where they're going. They didn't have the experience, and they were what we call ultra left-wingers. And they had got out, and that is what the mining company wanted. They reckoned then the mine was flooded, they'd lost the reef. Well, anyone that has any practical experience knows you can't lose a reef through being flooded. Because how did it get there in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
It's there.
Yeah.
But they were able to cover this up.
Mm-hmm.
And in the doing so, they smashed the trade union movement in New Zealand, set it back quite a lot, and also covered up the swindle. The shares on the London stock market, on the value, what was nominally 5 shilling shares, of which only a half a crown, 25 cents was paid up, they went to £10.14 and 7pence on the value of that price of the 10 guinea crosscutter of the gold working worth 10 guineas a tonne. Of course, the mouth of the reef was 138 feet wide at that part. But as I say, they broke into this on the footwall side when they drove in, and they broke up into the calcite. But they falsified the reports.
Mm.
When you go into politics and trade union affairs, you find this tied up. I had experience of this in Australia. I became honorary secretary of the union at Mount Isa at the age of 22 for the simple reason nobody else would take the job on. And I'd done a fair bit of reading, study. I could see this, and I learned of the chicanery and the tie-up of big businesses with the big money.
And indeed, you got out of unions, of course, fairly soon after the 151-day strike, didn't you?
I went back to work, and then the land that we had here, my mother, it had been leased, and the lease had run out. The person that had it on, and it was place that was gone back. I come and have a look at it. So, younger brother, and I, we both, and I were to toss, so I won the toss. So I came back and built. Well, there was no. The cow shed had been there on the place during the time. Somebody had pinched the iron off it, and so we had to rebuild. And anyhow, it was a bit of a struggle, but I eventually bought out the next door neighbour's farm and made a 100-acre farm. But
well, we'll just take you've got quite a good photograph of it, Bill, here, so we'll just take a quick look at that now, shall we?
Yeah.
See where you work. This is an aerial of the farm property, Bill,
And can you show us where it is exactly?
Well, this at the end of Bradford Street. That now is all tar sealed, and the houses around. My parents' land ran across this way. Originally, what was became a farm were originally three small farms,
Yes.
and the total acres about just around 100 acres between the three of them, and this is the original property the parents had. On the either side here in the foreground, that was part of the other property that extended up almost into the Victoria Street, the back end of it. And the other side, there was where the old rake line went in between the property. That was originally taken up. Old Don Galley owned that originally. Then we bought it up. It became the one farmland, and Waihi soil was actually, with high rainfall in its natural state, all this land was around here was just stunted scrub. And incidentally, we used to find little heaps of stones here. We couldn't, of course, as kids, we thought these were great for use in Shanghai. They were polished. But I found out that they were actually moa stones.
Gizzard stones, were they?
Yeah, gizzard stones.
Uh-huh.
Yes, and after they were worn down, right down, they were passed to out to the moa bird, and he left his calling card, and there was a heap of stones. And that could have been, it was untouched for, well, hundreds, we don't know how long, hundreds of years, until there was Waihi, till gold was discovered in Waihi, and then as it's from the countryside. Waihi, the soil was low grade, was leached with a high rainfall. Now it's impossible to have high rainfall and have high fertility leaching, but where you've got forests, of course naturally it's the plants, the timber, trees, they recycle the fertility, the minerals that are essential to plant growth. And so that's the reason why Waihi was partially bush sick, as they called it, short of cobalt and definitely short of potassium and phosphates.
Now, Bill, you returned to the farm in 1952,
Yes.
and from 1968 to 1974, you were president of the Waihi branch of Federated Farmers,
Yes.
and probably the only card-carrying communist ever to head a branch of Federated Farmers in New Zealand. Would that be right?
I would say so. I don't know of anyone else who had the same views as within the Federated Farmers.
But obviously, the Waihi branch was happy with the way you did things.
Well, yes, well, we had, we'll start for the first part. There was only a small number of farmers attended meetings, and nothing. If we got 8 or 10 out of 150 odd members, 157 members, we got 8 or 10, we had a good meeting. But unless there was some other reason. But people in New Zealand, well, the farming, the one-man farm, they were working, and they didn't get much, well, most of them weren't politically aware of what was happening. Now, so I take it you would want to know how I became in the first part to take the left-wing views I had.
Yes, please.
So it started, well, my father, the big strike in Waihi in 1912, the year I was born, and then people, the old chaps used to come in where we lived, the corner of Victoria Street and Robert Street. There was a hedge there, and old chaps would come and sit there, and I happened to be an English chap, came more particularly, and he'd had a bit of experience of the Chartist movement in Britain, and he'd been a foundation member of the old original Labour Party, but he came out to New Zealand and finished up in Waihi. And anyhow, he'd take discussions, and I used to listen to these the chaps were talking. And well, I went to the South School of Waihi, and then I got my proficiency, but I wasn't. My father, whose health had gone, and they'd taken up this bit of land, and I had to work on the farm, and so I went to night school. And as was pointed out, I said that one of the subject, or the main subject I took up, was theoretical electricity, which involved quite a lot of discussion on well, matters of physics and things like the laws of physics. So I stayed behind one night and asked him who it was, like Ohm's law and Newton's law, the different things like that, and well, laws that apply to electricity. And I asked the tutor who had made these laws, and he looked at me for a while and he explained carefully. He must have thought I was pretty dumb. Well, I was, because I'd never heard about these laws of nature. And he explained to me that these laws were laws of nature and that they had been found by experiments and so forth. First of all, they were a hypothesis, then it became as I got more information, it became a theory, and then later, as they found these things applied, answered all questions, became taken as natural law. Later, I did.
And what caused you to join the Labour Party, Bill?
Well, of course, the crisis, the depression, and everybody was wondering, talking about it, and I thought, well, the Labour Party is the party of labour of the working people, so I joined it. But I found that there was no discussion. They were just talking about Labour and getting Labour Party into government. That didn't satisfy me, because the point is, what were they going to do? We had to find out the cause of why there was a depression. And that was my line. So as they say, they told me to go home and let my whiskers grow. Well, that's not the answer. And when I read this about how the Soviet Union was developing their planned economy, they didn't have a depression. So I found, I inquired about the Communist Party, and I've read, as I said, I have read Marx's Value, Price and Profit, Wage, Labour and Capital, which gave it, it's a popular part of it, which showed me that we had a struggle on our hands. And that, to me, the Communist Party was the only party that got down to investigate and understood that it came back to one simple fact: which had the greater validity, laws of nature or man-made laws? To me, it's the laws of nature. We've got to understand the forces of nature and how they apply to us. If we don't, then we're lost.
So in that year, 1932, you joined the Labour Party and left the Labour Party and joined the Communist Party.
Yes.
And today, what do you reckon your status in the Communist Party is?
Well, it's a faith in humanity.
Right.
The Communist Party, or the Communist movement throughout the world, has been smashed, but it's developing again. The centre of gravity is shifting from Europe now to Central America, and that's where the big change is going to come. China.
Of course, what you're best known for, Bill, is letters to the editor, all those signed W.E. Lawrence, and you wrote those for 20 years.
Yeah.
How effective do you think they've been?
Well, I don't know. At least some people know who I am. But I've tried to, just as I saw events, and to me the way forward, people have got to take interest in their own affairs. Don't leave it to someone else. That's the message I've tried to get across to other people. There's no one can solve our problems for us. We've got to solve it ourselves. And we've got to be aware of the enemy within ourselves. This me first, that unfortunately is part of the system, part of our way of life. Unless we get rid of that me first and believe what I can do to save this planet, that's what I'll end up with. That's been my aim. I've never set out to take anybody down, and I've just tried to get this point across.
And I think you've done it very well indeed. At this point, Bill, I'd like to thank you very much for submitting to this interview and allowing us to get something of your life down on tape. Thank you very much indeed.